So welcome everybody. I'm Vivien Schmidt. I'm professor of Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration here at Boston University. I'm speaking for Kaya Schild, Director of the Center for the Study of Europe, to welcome all of you. And this is a lecture talk in the context of a stronger Europe in the world, a lecture series on the initiative of the Jean Monnet Chair of Kaya Schild, also a Jean Monnet Chair at Boston University. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Daniela Caruso is here as well, and also a Jean Monnet Chair. So we are honored to have all these Jean Monnet Chairs. But we're even more honored to have Federico Fabbrini, who is going to be talking about the war in the Ukraine and the future of European integration, the case for an accession and reform treaty. And Federico is full professor of European law at the School of Law and Government of Dublin City University, where he's the director of the Law Research Center. He's also the founding, this goes on and on, just so you know, he is really very active here. He's also the founding director of the DCU Brexit Center, where he's the principal investigator of both the EU-funded Jean Monnet Network Bridge, the EU-funded Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Rebuild, and the EU-funded Jean Monnet Module Post-Brexit Law. He is also involved as a WPPI, a principal investigator in the Horizon Europe project, REGROUP, of which I am also a member. So Federico carries out research in the field of EU law and policy, and his research agenda spans broadly fundamental rights, economic governance, institutional design, Brexit, COVID-19, and the future of Europe. Federico's research is strongly characterized by a comparative approach, notably with the federal system of the United States. He's highly interdisciplinary, and he pays a lot of attention to policy implications. I should also note that he is a cavaliere, so a knight, a sir of the Italian Republic. So on that introduction, please welcome. Yeah, thank you for being here.
And thank you very much, Vivien, for, first of all, your kind introduction. And secondly, for the kind invitation to be here with you today. I want to extend my gratitude to Kaya, to the Center for the Study of Europe, and to Boston University for inviting me back. I had the pleasure to be, I think, in the room across the hall exactly a year ago. And I am very grateful of the opportunity to return today with Italian pizza as an additional perks connected to the talk. So thanks again for arranging this, and thanks to all of you for being here today. So the topic I will be presenting in my lecture is something I've been working on basically for the last 18 months. And is unsurprisingly the result of the beginning of the war in Ukraine in February 2022. So the title of my talk is The War in Ukraine and the Future of European Integration. And what I want to do in my remarks is to give you an overview of how the war has affected European integration, including by opening up the prospect of Ukraine accession to the European Union. And so I want to discuss what are the consequences of this conflict and also what are some policy opportunities for facilitating the integration of Ukraine in the European Union in the future. Hence the subtitle, The Case for an Accession and Reform Treaty. Just as a commercial advertisement, the work I am carrying out builds on some of my recent publication. In the last couple of years, I published in December 2020 this book called Brexit and the Future of the European Union, The Case for Constitutional Reforms with Oxford University Press. And then last December 22, I published this other book called EU Fiscal Capacity, Legal Integration After COVID-19 and the War in Ukraine. And in a way, the presentation I'm giving to you today, which is part of an ongoing research project, is a follow-up to the work I did in the last few years, because again it's focused on how recent crises have affected the project of European integration, but also how ongoing crises have exposed weaknesses in Europe that I think will need to be addressed. And in fact, to go straight to sort of the purpose and the core argument of my remarks this morning, I want to put my cards on the table right away. As I said, the aim here is to examine the impact of the war on Europe, and my argument is that the war has been a Zeitenwende, a turning point in history, as German Chancellor Scholz famously said a few weeks after the beginning of the war. But at the same time, the war is also an incomplete constitutional moment for the European Union. The EU has advanced in many policy areas in response to the war, but in fact, in each and every of the policy areas where there have been advances, the EU has also revealed ongoing structural weaknesses, which are very much the result of its weak governance structure and also its limited competencies and powers. Hence, moving forward, and this is the more normative part of my argument, I think the European Union needs to address its structural shortcomings, particularly in order to prepare for the accession of Ukraine. It's simply unthinkable that the European Union could absorb a large and poor country like Ukraine with its current constitutional structures. So how am I going to develop this argument? I've been thinking about this, and obviously I knew I was talking to mostly an American audience. So in reflecting on how I could unfold my thoughts and sort of structure my approach, I've taken the freedom to draw inspiration from something many of you in the room will know very well, the preamble of the United States Constitution. Now, Vivien said it, I'm a lawyer, I did a lot of work on comparative constitutional law and federalism, so this is also a home run for me, going back to the American preamble, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with these words. They are 250 years old, but they have in many ways witnessed and passed the test of time. And they have become a sort of emblematic summary of the core constitutional function of a government in a federal union of states. As the preamble to the American Constitution famously says, the Constitution was ordained and established in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, you know, in the American legal and political debate, there's obviously much discussion whether the US has itself lived up to the sort of goal and objectives proclaimed in the preamble, but I'll leave that to the side, and what I want to do rather is use the wording of the preamble, which is very short and very effective, as a sort of a benchmark to help us think through how the European Union has responded to the war in Ukraine. So I will use those categories basically to reflect on these 5 points. How did the European Union provide for the common defense in response to the war in Ukraine? Secondly, how did it promote the general welfare in response to the war in Ukraine? Thirdly, how did it establish justice and secure domestic tranquility in response to the war? Fourthly, how did it secure the blessing of liberty? And last but not least, how did the EU form a more perfect union in response to the war? Now, what I will be arguing is that in each and every of these 5, you could call them policy area, the European Union has moved forward, so there have been advances in integration in response to the war in Ukraine, but in each and every of these policy area, you've also seen setbacks, difficulties by the EU to fully take up the challenges that the war has raised on integration. So allow me to go through all of these 5 points, giving you a sort of a overview, almost a mapping exercise of what the European Union has been doing since the beginning of the war 18 months ago, and then conclude with some sort of critical assessments and policy proposals forward. So I'll start with the first point, which in many ways is the most obvious when you think about a military conflict. And in the field of, as we call it, the EU law and politics is full of acronyms, and I guess many of the students have become familiar with many of these acronyms by now, but just don't hesitate to stop me if something written on the slide makes no sense. But in EU legal jargon, we refer to CFSP when we talk about common foreign and security policy, so all the EU policy dealing with defense, military, and foreign relations matters. Now, since the war, the EU has done extraordinary things in that area, things that up until this point many thought were totally unthinkable. To begin with, the European Union rolled out a European Peace Facility, which is a new tool to provide weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces. The European Union also set up a special purpose vehicle to provide funding to the Ukrainian government, known as the MFA Plus, which is now transformed into a Ukraine facility as a budget of almost 50 billion euros to provide continuous funding to the Ukrainian authorities. Also, the EU adopted something called the ASAP, which is obviously a significant acronym, but the word stands for Act in Support of Ammunition Production, and it's the first ever inroad by the EU in the field of defense procurement. So the European Union is now commissioning the purchase of weapons directly to the industrial military complex and has a special budget through ASAP to do so ASAP. Moreover, there's new powers given to the Commission in the field of industrial procurement for defense purposes, and the EU has also set up a military assistance mission in Ukraine, where EU officials are now on the ground in Ukraine training the Ukrainian military forces on how to use advanced technology weapons that have been provided by member states. Now, this is extraordinary if you think about the fact that basically until 2022, nobody thought the EU could do anything really in the field of military matters. And yet, I also want to highlight the other side of the coin. There have been advances, but there are also a number of important setbacks in the field of foreign affairs and security, as revealed prominently, I would say, by the dominant role that NATO has come to play in securing European security since the war. As you know, Finland and Sweden, two countries which traditionally were neutral, so not part of the military alliance, have now joined NATO, and everybody expects NATO to be really the big player when it comes to putting the boots on the ground. In fact, while the Union adopted a strategic compass, which is a sort of a roadmap on how it should address global challenges, this compass is, I think, in many ways very light. There is a lot of confusion in there and very little strategy. So in a sense, the hope by the European Union to develop a strategic autonomy have proved to be just that, hopes, because it's really NATO that does the big business of security. So a very mixed picture in many ways. Now let me come to the other, a second policy area which I want to address this morning. I call it here promoting the general welfare, drawing from the US Constitution preamble, and I'm really referring to economic, energy, and trade policy more broadly. Here again, the European Union has managed to do extraordinary things since the beginning of the war. In the field of energy in particular, Europe in few weeks managed to phase out of Russian fossil fuels on which it was heavily dependent. For example, the European Union approved a program called Repower EU that helps countries find new energy sources, particularly renewable energies, and funds those programs by also helping citizens which are more affected by the increase in energy costs. In fact, the EU also set up a social climate fund to help in the energy transition. And more generally, in the field of trade, for example, the EU adopted a large set of new legal and policy tools to deal with global competition, from anti-coercion instrument to foreign direct investment screenings and so on. So I think there is a growing sort of geostrategic maturity by the EU in that field. And yet, if you think about the economy and economic policy more generally, these advances once more are compensated by a number of setbacks. And Vivien has written extensively about this. For example, the Commission has proposed creating a sovereignty fund to create a common pot of money to invest on new technology, but that has not been approved because of German opposition. There is still ongoing debate about the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the main regulatory framework for budget policy in Europe. And I think the looming question is, we don't know what's going to happen to the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, these major programs set up in response to the pandemic, which, however, is coming to an end technically in a couple of years' time, unless it is renewed. And of course, if you think about what it might cost to rebuild Ukraine or absorb it into the EU, once you still see quarrels about, those little amount of money, you can't help but conclude that, in fact, the EU is suffering from serious weaknesses in this field. Let me move to the third policy area I wanted to touch on this morning. I'm putting here, again, under a label of establishing justice and securing domestic tranquility. And with this, I am mostly reflecting about developments in the field of the area of freedom, security, and justice. This is the old third pillar of European integration. Also in this policy space, in this policy domain, progresses and setbacks have occurred at the same time. We've seen important progresses, for example, with the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, which has allowed almost 2 million Ukrainians to live, reside, work, and move freely in the European Union. This is the first time ever that the EU has approved or actually implemented this directive specifically in response to the war. Also, as you know, in the field of home affairs, the European Union has set up mechanisms to investigate Russian war crimes, including by deepening cooperation with international criminal courts, and the EU has adopted several rounds of sanction using, for the first time ever again, the instrument of criminal law to target individuals who are associated with Putin. So once more, significant step forward by the EU institutions in response to a war, and yet, once more, major setbacks. So the field of migration remains one of the most difficult to resolve in the European Union. Almost 4 years ago, the Commission proposed a migration pact, and that has not been approved. 2 weeks ago, there was a big meeting in Granada, Spain, and the heads of governments could not agree on a 2-line paragraph in the final conclusion talking about migration. So the poor president of the European Council had to publish its separate sheet of paper with the 2 lines that were not endorsed by Poland and Hungary. And if you think about sort of domestic tranquility, I have to mention here the grain crisis, which I find something extremely interesting. As you know, to help Ukraine, the European Union has waived custom controls on the import of agricultural products. Ukraine produces what I think is probably one of the 3 biggest producers in the world of wheat and some other grains. And that was meant to help them ship these goods to the rest of the world as well. But the moment the EU did so, the borderline countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, which are all staunch supporters of the Ukrainian cause in principle, they immediately said, we won't respect those rules. So we will still impose controls on the import of grain. So that shows, again, the difficulties connected to the decision-making system of the European Union and the limitation of the current setup. Now, let me come quickly to the fourth point I want to address, and I'm putting it under the emphatic label of securing the blessing of liberty. And by that, I obviously have to talk about enlargement, which I think was really one of the most extraordinary developments since the beginning of the war. The EU had enlarged over 70 years, but in the last decade, nobody thought the EU could expand any further. In fact, it was totally taboo to think about enlargement. After the explosion of the war and under the pressure of a devastating conflict, In June 2020, the European Council promised to Ukraine that it will become a member of the European Union. And it also promised to Moldova that it will become a member of the EU. And it also promised to Georgia that if it does its homework, it might become a member of the EU. And that has also reactivated discussion about enlargement in the Western Balkan countries, 6 of them. Now, there's no way to make sense of this if you don't think about the blessing of liberty. Because the whole point about enlargement is really to make sure that Ukraine can consolidate as a democracy and find protection within the framework of the European Union. When Zelensky asked for membership, it saw that as a crucial step to protect the freedom of Ukraine against an imperialist Russia. And yet, if the EU remains a promise or a beacon of liberty for countries outside, the EU is suffering of tremendous liberty problems inside. As a lawyer, I have to speak about this. We talk about the rule of law crisis. We have been talking about this for a decade almost now. Many member states of the European Union are experiencing a dramatic process of democratic backsliding. And what's more, which is why I want to talk about it today, the war has worsened the democratic backsliding. Particularly in Poland, and okay, there were elections 2 days ago, which ended up going fairly well from a liberal democratic perspective, but there's a lot to be seen on what's happening there. And yet, there's no doubt that during the last 18 years, Poland, the Polish government, has gotten a blank check from the European Commission in terms of rule of law compliance, because Poland was so good in helping Ukraine and hosting Ukrainian refugees, which led the Commission to say, okay, we will not mess too much with your domestic backsliding. So what you see here is once more how the war has led to both progresses and setbacks in integration. And that takes me to the very final point I want to, policy area, or here it's really institutional domain that I want to discuss in my overview. The question about forming a more perfect union. As it happened, the war in Ukraine coincided with a lively discussion that was taking place in the EU about the future of integration. And the main institutional framework for this was this innovative project called the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is the first attempt by the EU to reflect on integration from the bottom up by setting up an experimental process of participatory democracy with several hundred citizens across Europe being involved in this initiative. Now, as the Conference on the Future of Europe was unfolding, the war exploded, and definitely that affected very much the reflection that was made. And in its conclusion, the Conference on the Future of Europe proposed a serious, well-argued set of institutional reforms, including changes to the EU treaties that have to be made in order to prepare Europe to the next decade. In fact, very interestingly, on the concluding event of the Conference on the Future of Europe, French President Emmanuel Macron also proposed creating a new thing, what he labeled the European Political Community, EPC, which is the idea to have a new organization outside the European Union involving all EU member states, but also the other European countries, many of which aspire to join, but also countries who, in fact, left, like the UK, with the view of having a framework, a forum in which they can discuss common challenges from energy to migration to security. And the EPC was indeed created exactly a year ago, in October 2022, and has been meeting 3 times since then. So what you see here is a sort of an effort to adjust to changing circumstances and to push the EU to reflect also on its institutional outlook. And yet, as I need to talk about setbacks, the reality is nothing has really happened. We have seen all types of proposals about changing decision-making structures in the EU, removing unanimity. No real action has taken place. And the reason is, of course, that every member state has a veto right on reforming the European Union under Article 48 of the Treaty on the European Union. And so if just one single government does not agree with changing the current institutional structures, then we are paralyzed. So where does this leave us? Now, my sense, and I hope the presentation I've given you so far, is that the war has prompted the EU to react, and in many policy domains, the EU has done remarkable things. And yet, the war has highlighted once more some structural difficulties in the functioning of the European Union. And these are ultimately connected to decision-making structures and competencies. Decision-making is very difficult because it relies on unanimity, and so every single state can block decision from the Migration Pact to the approval of a sovereignty fund. And competencies are limited. So the EU doesn't really have authorization under the treaties to undertake military and defense operation. And in many other domains, from energy to justice and home affairs or economic governments, its powers are limited. Now, this is not a good precondition to bring Ukraine in. If we talk about enlargement being based on the absorption capacity of the EU is not ready, is not fit for that type of enlargement. And I think the war in this respect has underlined once more the need to reform the EU powers and decision-making structures. Vivien, I guess, is smiling because, in fact, this is a conclusion we reached after the euro crisis, it's a conclusion we reached after the migration crisis, it's a conclusion we reached after the pandemic crisis, and the war has simply strengthened arguments that many academics have made. But the war has also given a new urgency to this discussion, and I would argue the war and the prospect of enlargement has ironically also created a window of opportunity for reform. Because, as you all know, to bring a new member state into the European Union, you need to adopt an accession treaty. And according to Article 49 TEU, an accession treaty can bring about reforms to the original sort of power structure of the European Union. Historically, the type of reforms that are connected to accession have been very limited, like adding extra seats to the European Parliament for the new accession state. But what I would argue is that we could think, from a policy perspective, of a more ambitious combination of a reform and accession treaty, where the two go together. And the advantage of this is that you would kill two birds with one stone, two pigeons with one stone, so to speak. You would make sure that Ukraine can become a member state, but at the same time adjust the EU institutional structures and overcome some of its structural shortcomings, while also, I think, bypassing the risk of veto that you would have on a standalone reform negotiation with many countries opposing that. So if I were to make my policy pitch forward, I think by combining these two processes, we might be able to get a more satisfactory result. But folks, I'm conscious I've spoken longer than what I should, so let me come really to my conclusions to wrap up. To summarize again, I think the war in Ukraine has been a turning point for European integration. And while the world is obviously absorbed by new crises, there's always new things happening, including dramatic developments in the Middle East. The war remains for the EU, I think, a pressing concern. And because of the war, the EU has advanced and integration has moved forward, but the war has also highlighted setbacks in the European response, which have to do with ongoing structural issues. So moving forward, I think we need to address these weaknesses by reforming the EU, and enlargement, while being a major challenge, could be also an opportunity, particularly if, as I just proposed, we can combine these two processes and do at once the reforms that the EU needs and the enlargements that probably is inevitable. The key point, and I'll end on that note, is I think we need to think ahead and sort of break that autopilot mentality that too often is at play in Brussels and elsewhere. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here.
Thanks so much. That was really quite a tour de force, especially giving us a sense of how much the EU has already done, which one forgets. You read the papers every day, and you see, oh yes, the EU has done this in response to the Ukraine. Oh, the EU has done this. And I kept taking notes saying, oh yeah, so much. So I think what we can say is that the EU has actually stepped up to the plate, done a lot more, just as we could say in the COVID crisis, I mean, in both COVID and the Ukraine crises, what you see is a major shift. Before Eurozone crisis, it was kind of, let's call it negative integration, and now we see much more positive integration. But still there's so much. So I'd just like to push you a bit. And one is you sort of stopped just as I thought, okay, he is going to give us the answers. How is the EU, what should the EU do to reform? So, unanimity rule, get rid of, what you put in its place. So there's all the institutional reforms, the legal obstacles, but I think those are possibly easier, that's question one, than question two, which is, in this whole discussion, you've been talking as if the Ukraine will, in fact, join. But in my reading of this, the EU, any number of member states that had been totally opposed to the joining of Ukraine, all of a sudden shift massively. Macron, among others. Could you argue that the saying that Ukraine will join, but this is going to be a long accession process, could be 50 years, could be 80 years, as opposed to day after tomorrow, i.e. the day after all of your reforms that you're going to tell us about are put into place, then the Ukraine joins. Is that possible? Could this have been just, yeah, we love you, the Ukraine, yeah, pat you on the back, yes, you'll become a member, but don't tell anyone, that's going to be at least 50 years down the road. You have to become a democracy, you have to meet all the accession criteria. That's a lot of work. So that would be another question. Also, and obviously you wouldn't, but there are all the geopolitical questions. This would be really poking the Russian bear in the eye. Ukraine, you mentioned Georgia, same thing. So what about all the geopolitical problems that would be involved in bringing Ukraine in? But we can bracket that. We know that can be an issue. But also there's the issue of size to bring in the Ukraine. This is bigger than Germany in terms of territory, as well as, I think, in terms of numbers of inhabitants.
It would be the fourth largest member.
Fourth largest.
Fifth largest after Spain.
Okay. But so I think there are all of those. But you don't need to really respond to that. Just as how do we reform the EU? It's been so long. Everyone's been talking about it. I remember writing something in 2009 saying that you needed to reform the unanimity rule, but the only problem is a catch-22. You'd have to have unanimity to reform the unanimity rule. And you're not going to get that. Or you may not. So how are you going to manage this?
Vivien, thank you so much for these two thought-provoking and very difficult questions. And you see, I didn't speak about it during my talk because I knew you would ask me about it to open up our conversation. So I'll actually take them in reverse order because I think conceptually question two actually comes before question one. And the question, will Ukraine become a member, is obviously a prospective question which is impossible to answer. I don't have the crystal ball. But what I think it's possible to say is that there are two ways in which the accession process, enlargement, can be conceptualized. One is as a technocratic exercise of box ticking, where the institution check whether accession countries have met all the objective criteria for becoming members. And the second way to conceptualize enlargement is instead as a sort of a geostrategic, geopolitical choice. Now, if you go back in the history of European integration, I think at the end of the day, all enlargements were more geopolitical than technocratic. The Commission would not agree. If you talk to Commission officials, they'll say, no, we did our homeworks, we negotiated all our accession chapters, and we verified whether the accession countries were implementing the acquis communautaire or not. But in the end, all enlargement processes, ultimately, the decision was made by head of state and government, and it was based on political consideration, including the decision not to enlarge. When de Gaulle didn't want Britain to join in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't on technocratic ground, it was on political ground. And when we are saying Turkey cannot, negotiation with Turkey cannot advance as we speak, it's on political ground more than technocratic one. But particularly the last enlargements were all political. So the decision to bring in the 8 Central and Eastern European countries in 2004, and then when Romania and Bulgaria entered in 2007, it was decided that they would all come in together, basically. I mean, Romania and Bulgaria lost that train and came in a couple of years later. But Slovakia was behind Hungary in many ways, but it was decided that it would join together with Czechia and the rest. And I think with Ukraine, the situation is similar. There is major geopolitical pressure for the EU to take care of Ukraine. And the best way to do so, particularly if the conflict reaches a stalemate or if there is an armistice type of solution to it, is actually to make Ukraine a member state, because then the EU has enormous capabilities and knowledge and know-how on how to rebuild a country and make sure its economy reaches the average GDP of the Union and all that. And you guys know much more than I do Washington, D.C. and American politics, but I think it's likely that the U.S. will say, hey guys, we paid for the war, you pay for the peace. And if that happens, I think it will be very hard for the EU to just say, look, Ukraine is a really corrupt country, which it is. Ukraine is a really poor and underdeveloped economy, which it is. Ukraine is not meeting the technical criteria, which it does. And yet, I think that pressure will be there, which is a little bit what, honestly, and that's why I'm very grateful that you asked this question, it's what prompted me to think and sort of start this project, because I see major challenges coming from enlargement. And so it seems to me the right time to also reflect on how best to manage it, to prepare for it. And so here I come to your other question, which is about sort of the reforms. And as you rightly said, many people, yourself, myself, many others in this room for a number of years had been arguing and writing, the EU cannot function like it is. You certainly have many flexibilities embedded in the current structures, which allowed us to weather COVID, to also, as I pointed out earlier, respond to the immediate challenge of the war. But this is not sustainable in the longer term. Some reforms are needed. And yet, whenever we try to address in the last 2 decades the question of reforming the European Union as a self-standing issue, that went nowhere because of the risk of a veto point. And so my policy proposal here of combining enlargement and reform is perhaps a lawyer's clever thinking of how to overcome democratic problems, but perhaps really a sort of a grand bargain strategy to think about how to improve the functioning of the European Union while removing some of the veto points that would be associated to a self-standing reform debate. And I think here in particular of Central and Eastern European countries, which traditionally they have been those mostly opposing any effort to move from unanimity to qualified majority voting, any effort to move towards more federal powers in the EU on migration or external affairs. But they are also the countries that are more strongly pushing for enlargement. They are the member states that would like Ukraine to join as soon as possible. And so maybe an accession and reform treaty can be the space where Western countries like France and Germany, who had been calling for reforms and getting nothing over the last few years, can say, okay, we'll accept a quicker enlargement than what we would like, but in exchange, we need this, and that. And the East might buy to that. But again, that's speculative, and I'm just presenting it as a possible policy proposal.
I'm just going to add one little question and then open it up to the room. But you mentioned, the Central and Eastern European countries, but what about Germany? Germany has resisted most of the economic reforms.
Yeah.
It's all too expensive. Clearly, accession will be extremely expensive. How would you convince Germany? And do you think that it would actually agree?
I think,
Especially if the AFD gets another 10% beyond its current 10%.
this is obviously a difficult question again, Vivien, but I think if there's one member state that has been remarkably affected by this conflict, it is exactly Germany. Mm-hmm. It's probably the member state of the EU that has experienced the greatest Zeitenwende of anyone else. Eastern European countries had always been scared of Russia and always claimed that Russia was a threat, and Germany never bought that argument. In fact, it was very happy to strike economic deals with Putin to get cheap gas for its industry. So there is, I think, here really an extraordinary change of mind for Germany, which is suffering economically a very high toll as a result of this war. It's the only G7 country which will not be with positive growth this year and the next as a result of the war. And beyond that,
you're going to make them pay more money, which they already don't want to pay, in particular to Italy.
Right, but I think this idea that they are paying more, it's wrong, because ultimately the next generation EU is not German money; it's European money, and common debt can be a way to support the German economy down the line too. And if the trade, I guess many students here are working in public policy, right? The world of public policy is all about trade-offs, right? So it's either Germany pays more in the EU budget, or you allow the EU to issue more common debt. There's really no third way forward. So
this might be the answer.
This might be the answer.
Even to the problem with the fiscal reforms and all the rest. Thanks. Open it up to questions. Yeah?
Thank you so much. So this was I'm so excited by you setting this agenda. I consider EU constitutional reform to be way above my pay grade, but the fact that you're taking this on is exciting to me, with your brilliance, your clarity, but also your positionality, that you already are a scholar of federalism and EU constitutional law in this way. So I'm excited that you are framing this agenda. So I have one small pushback and then two big kind of philosophical contributions. The pushback a little bit is where you said that it was a setback that the EU was not quite like NATO in the security space because it doesn't have boots on the ground. And I would say to you, no one has boots on the ground except the country that was invaded. And this entire war is about supply chains and about industrial policy or market policy in terms of being support. Because NATO as an entity, it's not weak, but NATO action in this conflict is self-limiting because of Article 5. And so right now is essentially a deterrence insurance policy. And if an actor has a role, it would be the EU, and it is what it's doing. I would critique it in that it has not yet accelerated the plans that it has advanced because of things like supply chain limitations and all kinds of things. But I wouldn't dismiss it as less dominant than NATO in this conflict or in other relevant conflicts that don't involve direct fighting. And any NATO member is not going to be involved in direct fighting unless we're all dead soon anyway. This is just, it is not a scenario we want to be gaming out. And so I wouldn't dismiss the EU like that, because I just think that it is the central actor, theoretically and logically, in this conflict. So then about EU constitutional reform being tied to enlargement, I think that's just brilliant. I wish any of my students in my European integration class were here today. But we talk about this, about reforming the EU, and I was going to ask you Vivien's question, what would you propose? Because someone is going to be asking you in the next few years what to do. And so I have a suggestion and then a thought about how this could go terribly wrong in tying these two things together. So my suggestion is that the students in my European integration course, I make them read an article by a political theorist named Dan Dudney from Johns Hopkins called The Philadelphian System, about the constitutional moment in the United States and the innovation of that design. And he argues that the thing that allowed the states to essentially give up power to each other to get over this hump, this game theoretical hump of removing unanimity and actually allowing for a federal system to be created, is the idea of negarchy, which I hate it when people invent terms, but it's the idea of guaranteeing the limits to further integration. So it's about setting forth actual limits of the center's power, or Brussels' power. And so I just ask you if you think that that would be part of a reform package, is to guarantee like a stopping point to European integration, essentially, in the form of supranational authority. And then my caution is that I think that tying these things together is great, enlargement and constitutional reform, but don't you think tying those together would really make Ukraine lose in the conditions of its accession? I think of things like, wouldn't it be probably the largest logical recipient of agricultural funds if you actually counted it as whole, right? And so I bet they would probably get a 3/5 kind of rule. And so do you think that it could actually be worse for Ukraine and its economic development and its rights and its political development to have its accession be tied to constitutional reform? Because just to clarify, I think, like letting someone else in while you're giving a bunch of powers to the EU might be too much for member states.
Thank you, Kaya, for those great questions. I'm grateful you raised the point about NATO, actually, because it's interesting. Also yesterday when I presented at Harvard, an American scholar immediately said, well, I want to discuss about the criticism that NATO is sort of creating a setback for the European Union. And so thanks for making the point, because it allows me also to clarify what I meant here. And just to be clear, I'm a great fan of NATO. I've never been critical of it. I think it plays a very important role also in securing the transatlantic alliance and all that. However, the fact that Finland and Sweden join NATO is a signal that for member states which are not aligned, it's the military alliance with the US that matters, that provides that insurance policy because of Article 5. Now, as you know, the EU treaties also have their Article 5 equivalent. It's Article 42.7 of the Treaty on the European Union, a mutual defense clause. But that's not credible. And I think that's the point I wanted to emphasize here. So in a sense, what the EU endeavored to do since the beginning of the war, think of the Versailles Declaration of March 2022, was to develop what is called the strategic autonomy of the European Union, which is basically capacity to act on their own and capabilities to carry out a military operation as an independent force. And that has not been achieved. And I speak here as a European that is critical of Europe more than a European that is critical of the United States. The EU is piggybacking on the Americans. It's free riding on the Americans. EU states agreed in NATO to reach 2% of spending on GDP, and they are not meeting those spending because they complain that they have to spend on welfare and the EU budgetary rules prevent them from doing so. And so I think that's a short-sighted approach, also because we don't know who's going to be in the White House comes next November. So moving forward, to me, this is not a sustainable strategy, and that's basically what I wanted to say. But thanks again for raising that point. Now, on your two other questions about what type of reform, whether the Philadelphia model can work for the EU, and what that would mean for Ukraine. Now, let me start by saying something that, as a lawyer, perhaps Daniela will say more about this, but what's extraordinary to me of the American Constitution is that technically it's a constitutional coup, because the Articles of Confederation required unanimous agreement by the 13 states for amendment, and then Madison and his friends meeting in Philadelphia wrote a new document they called the Constitution and said this will be valid law if 9 states out of 13 ratify it, right? And that's extraordinary. And if you needed unanimity, Rhode Island would never have allowed you guys to adopt your own constitutions. And we are exactly in that same catch-22 situation. So a couple of years ago, I was asked by the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Parliament to think about ways forward for reforming the EU. And I didn't reinvent the wheel, but I proposed, let's look at the Philadelphia solution. We draft a new document, we call it the Political Compact for Europe, and we'll have 3/4 of the state ratified for it to enter into force. And the Constitutional Affairs Committee took it up, but it went nowhere, of course, because that's, I think, politically...
But I think the fiscal compact was very
Exactly,
much
and that's the model, exactly. The fiscal compact was done in that way, the European Stability Mechanism too. So you do a treaty outside the legal framework and change the ratification game of it. Now, there are a host of legal problems that follow from that, but I think it is a possibility. And just 2 weeks ago, a group of 12 persons appointed by 12 wise men nominated by the French and German governments published a report on European enlargement and European reforms, where they also discuss actually that option. What type of reforms to be included there? I think institutional reforms are indispensable. Unanimity doesn't work. It worked when we were 6, but it doesn't work when we are 27, and it's going to work even less if we become 35. So that has absolutely to be changed. But beyond that, it's not just a question of counting votes. I think, and here I look at you and your work, Vivien, it's a question about designing institutional structures that guarantee input legitimacy as much as output legitimacy. And we lack that. I mean, we could have a separate seminar probably on this, but when von der Leyen goes to Israel to show solidarity support to the Israeli government after the Hamas attack, who is she speaking for? Where is she drawing the legitimacy? I mean, when Biden goes to Israel, he has been elected, he has a democratic, electoral mandate. He represents a nation because he has been chosen by the people of that nation to speak for it. In the European case, that's so murky. She got a confidence vote by the European Parliament, but she was never a candidate. And then formally, she doesn't have any foreign powers whatsoever, because if you read the treaties, it's actually the president of the European Council, and the European Council itself that sets the EU foreign policy. So those things have to be addressed. You can't be a global player. You can't face military challenges if you don't have a governance structures that is fit for purposes. And then you have issues about power. So last year I spoke here at the Pardee School exactly about this topic. I mean, look at the fiscal and taxing power of the European Union. Basically, the EU cannot introduce direct taxes. And how are you going to refund the reconstruction of Ukraine that is going to cost 2 trillion euros if you can't levy taxes? That's, you have to change the treaty to do that. And again, it requires unanimity. Or we have a balanced budget rule in the treaty. So the EU cannot incur debt unless it raises its revenues to the point that it covers and brings to balanced budget the revenues and expenditures. Again, you can't have a standing army if you have a balanced budget. And that's, I think, the American. So there are, I think, a number of issues here that in many ways are also well known because they've been discussed over the years, but have to be tackled. Final point, will this benefit Ukraine or not? It's a good question, but my sense is I think it would benefit Ukraine in the end to join a stronger union. I don't see major value for Ukraine to joining a union that is becoming yet another type of international organization. We already have the Council of Europe, which is toothless. Yeah, okay, you're a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. They can condemn Russia for committing violations of human rights. They can, well, Russia now left the Council of Europe, so it's not even subject anymore to the European Court of Human Rights. But the sort of the operational powers, the teeth of these organizations are very limited. What the Ukrainian government wants from the EU is a strong union that can provide financial support, military support, as you also said, Kaya, and funds from agriculture to cohesion policy, and so on and so forth. So, sure, you have a greater surrendering of national sovereignty, but as has always been the case in the process of European integration, that's very much compensated by other benefits you get out of it. Sorry for the long answer to great questions.
It's great. Yes.
Thank you again for the talk. It is very interesting. I have 2 questions, and One is that if you have discussed the advances and setbacks, right? But if you analyze or assess the net, what would be your net assessment? I know that the setbacks are really important ones, right? And the second question is that you use the U.S. constitutional preamble as your framework for analysis or assessment, right? But if you use the European constitutional principles, would your analysis be different, or how different it would be?
This is a great question. Thank you very much for that. The two are obviously connected, because I think if you take as a benchmark what the treaty says, probably the net calculus of cost benefit or progress versus lack of progress is positive. So if you look at the treaties and what type of competencies they give to the European Union, what types of powers they vest in the institution, I think the EU has done quite a lot in response to the war. In many ways, stretching almost the principles of the treaties. But if you use, as I did, the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, which is admittedly a more ambitious plan for constitutional government, then I think the net assessment is negative. The EU is not yet there, is not yet at the point of providing, the common defense, securing a more perfect union, ensuring domestic tranquility, and so on and so forth. And so, clearly is a matter of perspective, you would say. But if you look also the policy statement by the European Council and many other institutions, the ambition is to go there. So I think it kind of makes sense to set those policy objectives and tasks and goals and see how to get them.
Thank you.
So I had a question regarding reform and the accession criteria. So is there a desire within the EU, is the desire strong enough that maybe the accession criteria could be reformed to speed up Moldovan and Georgian accession and eventually Ukraine? Because since the outbreak of the conflict, there was, I know the Moldovan government, there was a moment where they were afraid of Russian subversion, and the former pro-Russia party there had made remarks, and there's the territory of Transnistria with the Russian garrison, and there's all these things. And then in Georgia, I don't know what the legislation was that was passed or not passed, but it sparked pro-EU protests, and the Georgian public seems pretty anti-Russia, and there was the cruise ships of Russian vacationers, they didn't want to come. So it seems like these two countries, even though they haven't fulfilled the criteria, they don't want to be in the Russian sphere of influence. So is the EU, do you want to incorporate these countries sooner than later so that there won't be a pro-Russian reemergence, and is it possible to reform the accession criteria to maybe speed the process up?
That's a very good question. Thanks for raising that. So my sense is that the EU is not willing to change the accession criteria, so that would not be one of the topics to be reformed, so to speak. But what would definitely be something to be included in the sort of the reform laundry list, if you will, is strengthening the post-accession enforcement mechanism. So if I go back to my slide here about blessing of liberty, here when I was talking about the rule of law crisis, something we very much learned from the experience of Hungary and Poland and now Slovakia and to some extent Slovenia and Romania is that you had all these countries that up to the moment of accession were doing their best to respect liberal democratic principles, and then the moment they came in, there's no way to oversee them. We have weak procedure, Article 7, according to the treaties, where yes, you can start this complicated procedure, but it's going nowhere because the Council unanimously has to approve it. And I think there's widespread consensus that this is not sustainable. So if you bring in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which, as you pointed out, are experiencing these domestic tensions between pro-European and pro-Russian movement, it is perfectly possible that you might have a pro-Russian government in some of these countries, as you have it in Slovakia today, and you need to have mechanisms which are better than what we have now to prevent this from, becoming a problem for the whole union.
I just want to add here, one of the problems with membership is it's all or nothing. And especially if you're saying that it can take a long time for countries to get all of the democratic institutions in place, to create a liberal market economy, a whole range of, or a market economy, not even necessarily liberal.
Social market.
Social market economy, exactly. Maybe what one needs to do, and I've written about this, to talk about graduated membership, so that as you come into one policy area, we should talk about this, one policy area after another, you can actually have some kind of voting rights, that you have partial membership and partial responsibilities.
Yeah.
As a way of continuing to have the power of attraction of the European Union in this long process of becoming a member, because we know in the Balkans, you know, it's out there for another 50 years for Serbia and others, especially because they're not complying. And why would they comply? Since all they get is the kind of negative stuff and not so much benefits, but I shouldn't have said anything, sorry. We have one more question and two more questions, and I think we have to take them together because we're running out of time because you have to text.
So there's been like a lot of like scholarship saying that one of the reasons Russia invaded Ukraine was Ukraine was shifting too far from the Russian sphere of influence towards the European sphere of influence. And when you're talking about European expansionism, like offering membership to these former Soviet states, would that not further draw Russian aggression towards them and undermine the Europeans' goal of European peace and stability?
And Daniela.
I don't know if I can wait for this note.
No, I think we should, we should collect everything.
Sure. So I just wanted to go briefly back to the punchline of your presentation, which is the idea of doing it together, the enlargement and the reform, right? So just let me think this through, because it's very thought-provoking. So imagine we have two very difficult problems. Each of them seems impossible to solve in the present situation. So the proposal is actually saying, if we take two very difficult problems and we solve them at the same time, somehow this is going to be easier, right? So there is something counterintuitive about this proposal. And the second layer of this is that it's not just that these are two unrelated, very difficult problems. It's that they are presented as one aiming in the opposite direction of the other. It's either we deepen integration, which would be the direction of your reform, or we enlarge Europe. I mean, traditionally, historically, they have been two very opposite moves, one denying the possibility of the other. So the combination of the two seems to me really, really explosive. And so the big piece here that I think is really, in a way, counterintuitive, so I want to process this, is that, in a way, you are making a manifesto of a project, of a game theory thing. Like, you know, when you have a game theoretic strategy, you don't want to disclose it at the start. Because there's something about this that is integration by stealth at some level that you're like, you know, I want to trick you into wanting something because you want the other thing instead, right? So there's something about this frame of thought that you put forth that is quite striking. So, comments. And there was another question.
Yeah, there's one question over here.
Oh yeah, thank you. So I do have a question about I think many people in Europe actually, when it comes to EU enlargement or EU reform, people are talking about the idea of multi-layered Europe. And I think the idea is also mentioned in the German Franco proposal you mentioned, which just came out last month. So I'm wondering, what do you think of this idea? And one sub-question is that, how about Western Balkans? If we take in Ukraine, how about Western Balkans? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for this question. I think I need to cancel my flight and remain here the rest of the afternoon because those are great. I'll start with Daniela because I think she's raising a very important but also difficult point. But what I would say is that if you think about the past of European integration, deepening and widening have actually always gone together. So you never had deepening without widening, and as the EU widened, you also deepened it. The key point I would make, however, is that as a matter of law, the deepening and the widening were separate treaties. So you had treaties on accession and then reform treaties. And there is an incrementalism in it. So you have the accession of Denmark, Britain, and Ireland in the 70s, and then Spain and Portugal and Greece in the 80s, and then you get to the Single European Act, and then you have Maastricht, and then you have enlargement to Sweden, Finland, and Austria, and so on and so forth. So you have constantly this moment where you bring in new countries and then you revise the structure. I think if there's anything innovative, and probably there isn't, of my proposal, is to say, let's do it at once rather than separately. And the thinking here is that by combining the processes, which, as you say, are very complex, but you can neutralize some of the vetoes that you would have on self-standing negotiation, because some of the countries that might be against accession are in favor of reform, and some countries that are in favor of reform are against accession. And you can think of a grand bargain where they agree on doing both, but on terms that somehow, through compromises, that satisfies some of their interests. But I think we'll be busy with this for long term. So I'm sure there is time to come back to those questions. On the other question, multi-layered Europe is a very good one, and it connects with what you were saying. I'm actually a fan of it. The real problem is the accession countries don't like it at all. When Macron proposed the European political community, I think I have it here in my next slide, accession countries said, oh no, that's an antechamber to membership. We're becoming second-class citizen in this union. So I support it because I think it's pragmatically the reasonable way, but we have to face the reality that this is not what accession countries want. And on the other point about accession and war, again, thanks for that. I'll end up with this story that I always tell when I make my talks about the war in Ukraine and the future of European integration. You will remember when Zelensky first traveled outside of Ukraine since the beginning of the war, he first went to Washington and asked for weapons. He then went to London and asked for weapons, and finally went to Brussels and asked for membership. What does this tell you? I think it depends what's on offer, right? And I think that's why we are stuck with this discussion about accession and enlargement for years to come.
And I want to thank you for giving a wonderful